This is a handshake that never happened. According to every official record, these two men were never in this room. Their governments called each other enemies, regimes, threats to civilization itself. Yet for over a decade, this single agreement determined the price of fuel on street corners from Miami to Seattle. How does an alliance survive when it's built on pure hostility? And what happens when the silence finally breaks? Long before ideology, there was geology. In 1914, near Lake Maracaibo, the ground gave up its secret. What followed wasn't just oil, it was a new national identity. By the 1950s, Venezuela was among the richest nations on earth per capita. Caracas gleamed with modernist towers, a monument to petroleum's promise. But this wealth flowed through narrow channels. Its centralized power in Caracas, it created staggering inequality between a thin elite and a growing, frustrated underclass. Politics became a single question: who controls the oil money? For the United States, the calculation was simple, practical. Here was a stable, abundant source of crude, just a short tanker route from Gulf Coast refineries. American companies operated freely. This was extraction, not diplomacy. A partnership of pure convenience before the world became complicated. The foundation was poured. A nation's fate was now inseparable from the resource beneath its feet. But in the hills overlooking those glittering towers, resentment was building, and a new kind of leader was watching. As America's thirst grew, it faced a metabolic problem. Its own light, sweet crude was insufficient, and its vast refinery networks, billions of dollars of specialized steel along the Gulf Coast, were engineered for a specific diet. They needed heavy, sour crude to function at peak efficiency. Venezuela had exactly what these machines needed. Its oil wasn't just abundant, it was uniquely compatible, a perfect match of supplier and infrastructure. This created a quiet, critical dependency. Venezuelan heavy crude kept fuel prices stable. It protected profit margins. It was a strategic buffer, rarely mentioned in newspapers or presidential debates. The relationship was locked in place by engineering and economics. American refineries needed Venezuelan crude. Venezuela needed those refineries as its guaranteed buyer. It was a marriage of absolute necessity. But in Caracas, a man was rising to power who saw this American dependency not as a partnership, but as a profound weakness to be exploited.
Then, ideology entered the pipeline. Hugo Chavez ascended in 1998, a former paratrooper channeling decades of popular frustration. He spoke for those the oil boom had left behind, and he identified their enemy clearly. His rhetoric was a weapon, uncompromising. He reframed Venezuela's story as an anti-imperialist struggle. He moved swiftly to nationalize the oil industry, squeezing out foreign partners. PDVSA, the state oil company, was to become an engine of social revolution. But here lay the impossible contradiction. Chavez's entire project, the social missions, the subsidies, the political patronage, depended on a river of oil revenue, and the primary buyer of that oil was the empire itself. He needed the customer he vilified. The revolution required an enemy. The treasury required that enemy's money. This paradox would define everything that followed. And so the silent pact was forged. Enemies in the spotlight, partners in the shadows. While Chavez gave televised speeches condemning Washington, Venezuelan oil flowed uninterrupted to Texas and Louisiana. While U.S. officials denounced the regime, American companies negotiated confidential contracts for diluents and technical services. PDVSA's U.S. subsidiary, Citgo, operated a critical network on American soil, thousands of gas stations, pipelines, refineries. This was back-channel statecraft, conducted by oil executives and financiers, not diplomats. Both sides adhered to the unspoken rule. The rhetoric was for domestic audiences. The oil trade was for survival. The United States could not easily replace the volume of heavy crude. Venezuela could not find another market of that scale and proximity. They were locked in a reluctant, intimate embrace. Silence became the highest form of diplomacy. This delicate balance depended on one thing: the oil continuing to flow. But the very heart of the system, the Venezuelan oil industry itself, was beginning to fail. The first fractures appeared from within. Inside PDVSA, a quiet purge began. Technical expertise was replaced by political loyalty. Geologists and engineers were dismissed. The institutional memory of decades began to evaporate. Investment in maintenance vanished, in new technology, in the fundamental science of extraction. The oil fields, complex living systems, started to decay. The numbers don't lie. Production began its slow, irreversible descent. Venezuela was selling less of the very product it needed to sell more of. Distrust curdled on both sides. In Washington, analysts saw the decline and questioned the partnership's value. In Caracas, paranoia grew that the U.S. would weaponize its dependency. The foundation of the hidden pact, reliable supply, was turning to sand. These were the clear, measurable warning signs, visible to anyone reading the production reports instead of the headlines. They were, for a long time, systematically ignored. The pressure moved from quiet to public. The United States escalated. First, financial sanctions, targeting individuals. Then, the decisive move, oil sanctions, an attempt to cripple the regime's economic heart. Venezuela responded by trying to pivot. It sent more oil to China, to India. But the economics were punishing, the distances greater, the discounts steep. Oil was now an explicit weapon in a public fight. But the result was not compromise, it was hardening. Pressure solidified positions. It accelerated the internal decay. The hidden pact was now openly hostile, a contradiction laid bare. And yet, even then, practical exceptions were made. Limited waivers were granted for specific companies to continue trading. The whisper of necessity still murmured beneath the shout of politics. The pressure was now public and intense, but the fatal blow, when it came, would not be delivered from Washington. The final collapse was not an attack. It was a failure of oxygen. PDVSA reached a point of systemic asphyxiation. The loss of skilled labor was catastrophic. When a pipeline burst or a compressor failed, there was no one left who knew how to fix it. Infrastructure failed. Refineries shut down. Simple maintenance became impossible. The industry didn't explode. It rusted. It stalled. It stopped. Venezuela could no longer produce the product that defined it. The relationship became impossible because one side could no longer hold up its end. The oil simply ceased to flow in meaningful quantities. The hidden pact ended not with a dramatic treaty annulment, but with the silent final gasp of 1,000 exhausted wells. When a partnership of this scale dissolves, the shockwave is global. U.S. refiners scrambled to recalibrate their machines. They sought replacement crude from Canada's oil sands, from the Middle East. Billions of dollars in trade flows rerouted overnight. Global markets absorbed the shock. Prices adjusted. New suppliers emerged. Venezuela plunged into deeper isolation and economic freefall. The weapon it had relied on was now useless. The tool of leverage was gone. The world observed a stark lesson in energy realism. Interdependence can be managed, but only if the underlying asset is maintained with ruthless competence. When ideology consumes expertise, the collapse is not just political, it is operational, total.
So where was the true point of no return, the single decision that made the collapse inevitable? It was not a sanction, not a speech. It was the internal choice, years before the crisis, to value political loyalty above technical mastery at PDVSA. The moment the guardians of the machinery were replaced by guardians of the revolution. That decision inserted a slow-acting poison into the system. It severed the industry from the knowledge that sustained it. It set a timer that could not be stopped. Compromise became impossible because one side was no longer a competent partner. The intent was to gain total control. The consequence was the loss of everything. This was the precise moment before things changed. This alliance reveals a durable truth about power. Oil does not erase ideology, it only finances the stalemate. It creates a temporary shelter where contradictions can coexist until they can't. Hidden alliances are the most fragile. They thrive in darkness and die in the light of political storms. They are agreements of immediate necessity mistaken for permanent strategy. The U.S.-Venezuela Pact was a masterclass in short-term necessity versus long-term reality. A lesson that what is economically logical can become politically impossible, that no resource, no matter how vital, is immune to the consequences of its own mismanagement. So we are left with a final, uncomfortable question. When necessity forces two enemies into a silent partnership, who is more vulnerable? The nation that controls the resource or the nation that has built its daily life around consuming it? The history of this alliance suggests the answer is not what we might assume.
It was the infrastructure that told the final story. Machines built for a century of service, falling silent in a decade. Each rusted bolt, each stagnant pipeline was a monument to a broken promise. The promise that oil could transcend politics, that necessity would always win over ideology. But machinery has no ideology. It follows the laws of physics and chemistry. Without precise care, without expert hands, it fails, irrevocably. The people who understood those laws were gone. The engineers, the geologists, the project managers. First they were sidelined, then they were pushed out. Finally, they left the country, taking a library of institutional knowledge with them. What remained was a hollowed-out corporation, a shell with a famous logo, producing spreadsheets and propaganda instead of crude oil. The decline was not a sudden cliff, it was a slope, a 2% drop one year, 5% the next. For years it was possible to explain it away, blame temporary disruptions, sanctions, weather. But slopes have a destination, and this one led to the floor. While one system was decaying, the other was evolving. American refineries adapted. They became more efficient, more flexible. They found new suppliers, blended new crudes. They invested in artificial intelligence to optimize every fraction of a cent. The dependency, once so absolute, became negotiable. The unique asset was no longer unique. The irreplaceable partner had been replaced. This is the true end of the pact, not when the last tanker sailed, but when the buyer looked at the ledger and realized the relationship was no longer essential, when the cost of managing the chaos outweighed the benefit of the crude.
That is the moment the silent agreement truly died. In a boardroom, on a spreadsheet, in a cold calculation of risk and reward. There were human relationships beneath the geopolitics, decades of technical exchange, shared projects, families that moved between Maracaibo and Houston. Those ties were frayed, then cut by forces far beyond the control of the people on the ground. They became collateral damage in a conflict of symbols and sovereignty. The story of oil is never just about barrels and dollars. It is about the people who find it, extract it, and the societies they build and unravel around it. Venezuela built a skyscraper on oil. The United States built an industrial diet around it. When the foundation cracked, both structures shuddered, but only one collapsed. The evidence is written on the water. The shipping lanes tell the story of the divorce. Where once there was a steady, dense stream of traffic, a maritime highway of dependency, there is now empty sea. The tankers found other routes, other partners. The ocean, like the market, abhors a vacuum. It filled itself. The fundamental calculus changed. For the United States, the equation shifted from security of supply to security from instability. The cost of managing a volatile partnership began to exceed the value of the oil itself. For Venezuela, the equation shattered completely. You cannot leverage a resource you cannot produce. A weapon you cannot fire is just dead weight. In the United States, the end of the pact was an adjustment, a recalibration in a complex global energy system. Some refineries underwent expensive retooling. Some gas prices saw marginal increases, but the lights stayed on, the trucks kept rolling. The system, built on diversity and redundancy, absorbed the shock. In Venezuela, the end of the pact was an ending, the final stage in a long closure. The nation that was once a global energy powerhouse now faces chronic fuel shortages at home. The circle closed with cruel symmetry. The treasure that built the country could no longer power its own cars. So what remains of the alliance that shouldn't exist? It exists as a case study, a lesson in the limits of realpolitik. It demonstrates that while oil can buy time, it cannot buy permanence. That hidden arrangements are the first to collapse when the pressure rises. And that the most fragile part of any system is not the steel or the software, but the human expertise required to sustain it. The flow stopped, the silence became permanent, and the world moved on, carrying the lesson to the next impossible alliance, the next necessary deal, the next moment before things changed. Before things changed.